Okay, so I have the distinct privilege of being joined today by Professor Johan Fourie. Prof, it's a wonderful privilege to talk to you today. Thank you so much for making the time.
It's great to be here, Phila.
Yeah, it's wonderful to talk to you again. It's been a while since we last spoke, and yeah, after the last time we spoke, I just thought we'd redeem ourselves with another conversation. So yeah, it is a wonderful, wonderful privilege to talk to you. Prof, I've been thinking ever since the end of the World Cup, and hence I wear the T-shirt I'm wearing today. Um, I've been wondering if you still feel after watching that World Cup or after hearing about the results of the World Cup, if you think we should still be crying for Argentina.
Well, there's some interesting news out of Argentina, I think even this week, about the idea of a common currency with Brazil. And my suspicion is that would indeed lead to more tears. Certainly, I'm very happy for Messi and Argentinians in winning the World Cup. I think it was a great World Cup. Of course, my final chapter ends with South Africa that could have participated. The way we could have participated in the World Cup required an investment, about a decade or so ago, and of course we weren't there. So I still have hopes that in the future we will make the necessary investments, even though that's a metaphor for a much bigger change.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a great World Cup, and certainly in Argentina there were tears, but this was, of course, there were tears of joy.
That's wonderful. So for those who didn't catch that pun, you should probably get Prof. Johan Fourie's book, which is the subject of our discussion today. Prof, it's wonderful, as I say, to talk to you again. I really do think that you wrote one of the most important books written in South Africa for as long as I can remember. And I'm not just saying this just because of this conversation, but because I genuinely believe it. When I talk to some of my friends, I genuinely tell most of them that if they have not read your book, they need to get it because it really is one of the best things coming out of our country. It's one of our finest exports, if I may say so myself. But maybe for somebody who has not yet read the book, I think let's touch maybe on why you decided to write such a book, and you can obviously go into some of the motivations for it and what you thought you would achieve out of writing it.
Well, first, thanks for all the recommendations. I probably need to pay commission at some stage. But it is wonderful to hear that people are enjoying the book. I must say that's you're not going to get rich by writing a book, so the only real payback, I guess, is in the experience that the readers share with you and how they feel that it is important. And I obviously also believe that it is important. That's partly why I wrote the book. And the motivation is very simple. It's a course that I've been teaching for the last decade or so, even more than a decade now. And the realization that many of my students in the class are not aware of many of the things that I say in the book. So basically, it comes down to the fact that we live in an era that is far superior to any previous era in terms of material welfare, material conditions that we live in. Relatively speaking, we have much lower rates of poverty than before. We have much higher infant health, so lower infant mortality, for example, than in any era of human history. And we have typically very romantic ideas of the past, and of course they are. It's easy to kind of romanticize the past, right? We all want to escape to the rural hinterland and spend a weekend away, and the simple comforts of life seem so attractive. But I think a simple graph showing infant mortality in 1800 compared to 1950 compared to today should expose the romanticism of those ideas. It's crazy to imagine that 3 or 4 kids in every 10 died within the first year of life in the past, and now that is way down, right? It's 4% or 3.5%, and in some rich countries it's even a factor of 10 less, right? It's 0.3 or 0.4. So just that remarkable improvement is something that we're just not aware of. We miss those kinds of the good news, I guess, is what you can call it, because we focus very much on the short run changes of our lives, and these long run changes are missing. And so that's the first real motivation, is to just kind of bring that to the fore, and especially to South African students, and written from a South African and African perspective. I think many of the books that I've read are written from kind of the West or European and American perspective, and of course, we see the kind of clear advantages that those societies have in terms of material welfare, but even within an African perspective, the African continent is much richer than it was before. It sustains a much larger population than it did before. So clearly, there is an improvement in just the absolute material welfare of Africans, and so that needed also to be pointed out. But I think the second thing is also about the why. So it's not only the what is improving, or that we are, whether we're improving, but it's also why are we improving. And this is really where we base it on, where I base it on kind of more recent economic history literature. Economic history is a thriving field. It's become very empirical. So we do research on large data sets of the past, and we try and understand, at least, to extract the reasons for why we see these changes across time. And so I thought that was also needed, that to be conveyed to a much bigger audience than just my classroom. And so when COVID hit, I started writing, and within a couple of months, I had a text. So that's really why the book came about. At the start of 2020, I would never have predicted that I would write a book. In fact, I had kind of a plan to write a book, but it was a very different kind of book. And so ultimately, this one was the one that materialized.
Yeah, and I'm really, really glad that it did. But I just really want to pick up on something that you merely brushed upon in your speaking segment just now. So you obviously teach economic history at Stellenbosch University. So what has your experience been like, teaching South African students about African history? Because I would imagine that at least part of the reason you wrote the book was because you saw, or you sensed, that there was a knowledge deficit, as it were, among South African students, and one should probably say African students more generally, about the African continent, and by extension by African history.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. It's every year it surprises me, and it probably shouldn't surprise me that much. But so I start my class by doing a little test, right, which is never popular. But I just asked them I put a map of Africa on, and I asked them to name 5 African countries, and these are not, it's not Mauritania, it's which you would probably expect many students not to know of, but this is like Botswana and Kenya and Nigeria and Senegal. These are the kind of bigger African countries, and you would expect many students to at least know where they are. And the average usually of that test is around 1 out of 5. Many students don't even know where Botswana is. And I mean, that's incredibly revealing, right? For South African students, there are, of course, African students in the classroom as well. So non-South African African students, but many South African students just have a very poor grasp of Africa, as a kind of a region, continent, but also then, of course, African history. And so I thought it is certainly important, and these are BCom students. But my sense is that that's true in most faculties of the university. So that's the one thing I do. And then the second test is I give them 5 historical episodes, and so the construction of the pyramids, and the French Revolution, and First World War, apartheid, these kind of things. So these are events that are pretty much spaced out of far apart, and you should have some sense of the chronology of when they occur. And again, like, the average is incredibly low. And so there's there's no geographical awareness. There's also no kind of time horizon awareness. And that, to me, is something that I think all students should have. And so that's partly why this course really focuses on South African history, but of course, looking at kind of global developments across time through the lens of South Africa.
Yeah, and that, I think, is one of the most important things about the book. I think it, as I said in the last conversation, it tells the economic history of our planet from an African perspective, which I think was really, really refreshing to read, certainly for me, and I know it will be for the listeners as well. But I'm just curious, Prof, two questions. So could the knowledge deficit that we have spoken about not be unique to Stellenbosch University? So it's a relatively small sample size, given obviously the size of the country. Do you think it's representative enough of the entire South African population, or is it something that's unique to the kind of students that apply to a university like Stellenbosch University? And then the second question, which I think piggybacks off of the first one that I've asked, is why do you think that might be? We are Africans, and we should, as you quite rightly point out, know the history, or at the very least a little bit about the history of our continent, but we don't seem to know that much. And I mean, I know about myself as well. I mean, I know a lot more about Western history than I do about African history, which is something that is embarrassing, but in a way, it's something about which I have very little control, because a lot of what's in the mainstream or what's out there to read is from a Western perspective, and that's partly why I think your book is so crucial, and that's why I think people really need to get it. But I'm taking a bit of a detour now. So yeah, the second question is, why do you think this might be? Why are African students in particular not so knowledgeable about the happenings of their continent?
Yeah, these are great questions, and of course I don't have the conclusive answers for them, but I've thought about them a lot. I think regarding the first question about the selection of students at Stellenbosch, that might be true, that it's a uniquely Stellenbosch thing. I sense that it's not. The representation of my classroom have changed quite a lot over the last decade, from what it was in 2011 to what it is now. The demographics of the classroom and the results stay the same. So that's at least some empirical evidence to suggest that these are not a specific cohort. And remember, Stellenbosch attracts some of the smartest students in the country. So my sense is that if they don't know much about the African continent, it's very unlikely that there would be another cohort of students from a different demographic background that would know much more. But that might be true. The one thing around the question of why, I mean, I think you alluded to the answer, and that is that we just never exposed to this, both in the formal curriculum at schools, but also in kind of informally what we consume. Now, you might say, well, newspapers just reflect what their readers demand. To some extent, that's true, and we are to a large extent far more influenced by what happens in the UK and in the US than what happens in potentially Nigeria or Kenya and so forth. So there might be a very rational reason of why we care more about those countries than we, through trade and through innovation. All of the products that we use are, American designed, Chinese manufactured. So if there are shocks in those regions, then they affect us far more than something that, some conflict, for example, in Eritrea and Ethiopia. Now a good example is in fact war, right? So we know much more about the Russia-Ukrainian war than we know about the conflicts on the Horn of Africa or Eritrea, and or in civil conflicts in Ethiopia, and so the reason is really because we are affected far more directly personally affected by the war in Ukraine than by any conflicts in Africa. So I think there's some potential rational thing there, but I also just think that it is to do with what we exposed to at school. And I mean, I can reflect on this very personally, right? So I've always been very interested in Africa, but I'm pretty sure if I took my own test when I was a second year, I would have failed it too, right? So it's not clear to me that I shouldn't be too just judgmental, over my students. I'm pretty sure that this is a very broad-based knowledge gap and knowledge deficit, and I just hope that we would increasingly see ourselves more as part of Africa than what we used to. I think South Africa is always is probably a strong word, but we've at least for the last couple of decades seen ourselves as kind of special and a unique case, and that's to do with our history. But I sense that increasingly, as especially Nigeria, as Kenya, Tanzania, as these countries, larger African countries, become more powerful, the uniqueness of South Africa will kind of wither away, and we'll be forced, in fact, to see ourselves more as African, and less as somehow kind of some unique country that sits somewhere between, the West, broadly defined, and Africa.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. So I think a nice segue from this would be, the kind of progress that you speak about in the book, but that, again, very few people who call themselves progressive, I shall say, know about. So it's very interesting to me when I talk to a lot of my friends, and I think this is partly because of of our biasness toward recent news or things that we're more frequently exposed to. Because if I pick up a random newspaper on any random day, it's more likely that I will read a negative story than a positive story. And I think you hinted at this not only in your speaking segment now, but in the book when you talk about the negativity bias, which I think is really, really true and very, very interesting to look at, especially from an economic history perspective. Because when you look at economic history, it tells a completely different story. And one so different, in fact, that one who picks up the newspaper and reads it as frequently as they possibly can just cannot get more wrong. So how do you think we can, deal with that? The fact that there's so much negative news in front of us or in our midst, then there is positive news, but we have so much positive news to, revel in front of. The poverty alleviation that's happened over the past centuries is immense, and it's worthy of celebration every single day. But very few people actually talk about it. I'm very curious, why is that the case? I have a sense that it's partly due to this negativity bias and the, large production rate of newspapers that spew out a lot of negative information, but surely there has to be a bigger or more broader and more descriptive reason as to why that might be the case. Do you have a reason as to why that might be?
Yeah, I think we are humans, right? And we've evolved to reduce basically our risk. So, right, if you walk in the veld and you hunter-gatherer, then you are more likely to react to kind of negative news. If you see a pack of lions around the corner, then you better run. So it's just we are this negativity bias is not something. It's not an irrational bias. It's something that's there programmed into us to help us survive. I guess the advantage of most people having a negativity bias is that entrepreneurs, innovators can utilize that, and through deep analysis, through research, websites like Our World in Data provide you with a platform to see where this immense progress has happened, and if you spend enough time understanding certain sectors, if you're aware of your potential negativity bias or biases, there are various kinds of biases, of course, recency biases, these kind of things, then you can benefit from that, right? You can invest in opportunities where most people wouldn't see an opportunity. Part of the kind of anecdotes in my book is about how most innovators or entrepreneurs invested during kind of crises, right? These are the times when there's rapid change, and we see it at the moment as well, right? Even in South Africa, when we think about the electricity crisis, we see there's a crisis, and so there's rapid change. We are rapidly moving to a very different way of generating and distributing electricity, which would never have happened had there not been a crisis, right? So, or not never, but it would have again taken a much longer time. And it creates opportunities for entrepreneurs and innovators to benefit from. So I don't think the negativity bias is wrong per se. It's there, and I guess we have to be aware of it. I guess part of it is not to just spend all your time reading, newspapers, and rather kind of combine that. Also, obviously, be aware of those potential risks. You want to know about the pack of lions around the corner, but you also you want to see the kind of longer term trends, and that is where books make a big difference. If you come across the right kind of books, that where scholars investigate these kind of longer term, more fundamental opportunities that you need to be aware of. I think that's great, and of course just through also careful observation within society, right? We are so pessimistic about the headlines, the negative headlines. But again, you see also, even just like walking around, you see construction, you see investment, you see entrepreneurs gathering in coffee shops, coming up with new innovative ideas. That's fantastic, right? But you would never see that necessarily in a newspaper. So it is just to be aware of different sources of information. I think that's critical, and not be too focused on just the headlines.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think let's spend a little bit of time talking about the mechanism that has generated the kind of prosperity that has lifted so many of us out of poverty, but that so many people are so oblivious to. I had a conversation with Nick Hudson not so long ago, and he gave me a piece of advice that I thought was really, really timeless. So I was asking him about, what kind of books he would recommend an individual such as myself or another individual who might be interested in learning from such people to pick up. And he said to me, he won't give me any title of a book, but what he will do is he will tell me that I should read books that are older than about 50 years or so, but he tries to make it more than 100 years because then those books are, if they're still being read today, it means they've stood the test of time and they've clearly got some wisdom that is ensconced within it. That books that are that are written now and that are bestsellers today, will wither away in the next few years and will be forgotten in the piles of antiquity. And I think one such or two such books that I think are worthwhile talking about, especially in the context of our conversation, are Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which I was very pleased, by the way, to see was on your reading list on your website. I actually did go back and I read it again. The other book is The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, because I think those two books coupled together are, at least in part, responsible for the kind of progress that we've seen over the past 200 years, as evidenced, again, not only by your book, but by Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now. So do you think that Adam Smith deserves far more credit than he's getting? Or do you think that people are right to criticize him for championing a kind of selfishness, as it were, as evidence, or not evidence, but as many people see from the Wealth of Nations?
Yeah, I think, firstly, I have to say that I didn't finish The Theory of Moral Sentiment. My holiday turned out quite differently than I'd hoped. But I think, more generally, I think it's very true that Adam Smith, firstly, is seen, is pigeonholed a bit as like, this free market kind of revolutionary almost. And that's certainly not who he was and what he had written. I think there's much to be gained from reading his books. I think they are not easy reads. So I wouldn't necessarily, prescribe that to an undergraduate student necessarily, but I do think there are a lot of very useful ideas that we forget about pretty easily that are ensconced, as you said, within those kind of older literatures. And we tend to kind of reinvent the wheel quite often, and forget that actually these issues have been issues for much longer than our generation or even the generation before us. And so there is much wisdom to be gained in reading the classics. They're not, they're written in a different language than what we are used to. So they are more difficult, I think. And someone reading them for the first time might find them very difficult to just extract the kind of meaning than by reading the kind of a more recent book. But I do think in terms of the kind of Adam Smith kind of worldview, the way he sees kind of progress is really, I mean, he is considered the father of economics for a reason, and the way that he sees the market being kind of central, not under playing the role of the state. So I think that's what many people don't read Adam Smith think Adam Smith's right, is that there's somehow no role for the government. That's certainly not true, right? Even if you just think of how he explains the importance of infrastructure, the need for the government to actively contribute to public goods creation is clear in his writing in the Wealth of Nations. So it's not this libertarian view of the world, but the centrality, I think, of the market, and especially I think key is the word competition, right? The importance of a competitive market is vital, and I think we somehow miss that point. So when we think of broadly speaking capitalism, most people, I think, when they broadly speak of capitalism, they think of these big oligarchic firms or monopolistic firms. That's not the kind of capitalism that Adam Smith envisaged, right? He was very much aware that big business have big problems as well, as do the overreach of the state that can also have big problems. So he very much had this idea of a competitive market where the price, right, mechanism would signal, would basically match consumers to producers, and the price signal is key in that, and what we should produce, how much of that we should produce, and those fundamental, they sound very simplistic to us, but that was a revolutionary idea at the time. The fact that there's no one that would determine the price of bread. It would just be a voluntary exchange that would ultimately, this invisible hand, right? That invisible hand doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some role for the state, but it's the state shouldn't determine the price of bread, because then ultimately you never find kind of this equilibrium in the market that satisfies both the consumers and the producers. So I think those ideas are certainly fundamental, and perhaps I think it was Paul Krugman, right, who once said that you can sound like a revolutionary by citing a first-year economics textbook, and the point really being that sometimes we forget these fundamental ideas, and so we, by making a very simple point, and an old, I guess, point, we can sound as if it's incredibly novel and innovative, when in fact it's a very old idea.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I think just two things from what you've said. The first is about the complexity of some of the older texts, particularly pertaining to Adam Smith in our case. There's a wonderful book by, I believe it's Russ Roberts. It's called How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, which really, I think, really simplifies a lot of these concepts and demystifies Adam Smith. Because I know that in economics, and you can obviously correct me if I'm wrong, there's a debate that happened, I'm not sure if it's still happening, about the Adam Smith problem, which essentially postulates that there's a contradiction between the Adam Smith of the theory of moral sentiments and the Adam Smith of the Wealth of Nations, and that he appears more humanist and a more kind of moral philosopher who's concerned about individuals and their emotions in the theory of moral sentiments. But then suddenly when he writes The Wealth of Nations 20 years later, he's this guy who champions selfishness. And it's not about the butcher or the baker. It's about like when he essentially postulates the invisible hand, it's not about selfishness, essentially, is what Russ Roberts demystifies in that wonderful book of his. So that's a book that I'd certainly recommend. And then with regards to the price mechanism that you speak of, I remember I was at the shopping center with my brothers not so long ago, and we were just walking down the aisles. And I remember saying to them, just imagine how complex it is to get a tin. It was canned food, the aisle that we were walking along. And you see some of it is made in Brazil, some of it is made in China, some of it is made in Vietnam, some of it is made all over the world. And then I asked them, just imagine what it takes to get that kind of product from Brazil to South Africa, and for you to pay, the cheap 20 rands that you have to pay for it. It's staggering. And I don't think they really quite got it until I actually asked them that question and they started thinking about it. Like, I don't think people quite realize the amount of complexity that surrounds us every single day. What do you have to say about that? I know Hayek says that a lot of the or that the wealth that we've seen, or the prosperity that we've seen over the past 100 years, can be put down solely to the price mechanism. Are you as fundamental about the importance of the price mechanism as he happens to be, or do you also think that it's important, but maybe not as important as he claims it is?
No, I mean, I'm quite a firm believer in the price mechanism as a way to organize what and how much is produced, right? I think that is for any, even if you're a benevolent dictator, right? If you want the best for society, the issue is that we just don't have the information of people's preferences, right? None of us have the same preference. And in fact, if you believe in freedom, right, in the ability of people to choose what they want, then you can never aggregate all of that little bits of information into one benevolent dictator that then makes a decision of what is produced in society and who is allocated that production. It's just impossible. Even with the smartest AI tools, you would never be able to do that. Um, so the only way to do that is to disaggregate that information, or to empower people from at the individual level to make those decisions themselves and to react to what is available based on their budget and then the prices that they have to pay for their goods. So that you're indeed incredibly right that what we've gained is this incredibly complex world, interdependent world, where we benefit from the comparative advantage of different places to produce the things that they're good at, and that then allows us to buy and consume way beyond what we would have been able to if we had to produce and consume, or produce ourselves the things that we needed, right? So the irony of, or I guess the paradox of the world really is that we've become so incredibly rich through interdependence. If you want to be independent, right? And there's a lot of claims now, especially after COVID, that we want a country that's independent, that we produce our own food, we produce our own, whatever. People have made that argument for almost any industry. Well, the thing is, as soon as you become independent, you also become poorer, because then you don't have this, complex world and interdependence, which allows you to buy things at a much lower price than what you can produce them yourself. So I think that trade-off is not always very clear. It's a very popular thing to say, is that we want to be independent, but no individual wants to be independent, right? So why should a country want to be independent? No individual says, I'm going to live by my own in kind of some rural area, produce my own food and housing and clothing. I want to kind of live this autarkic life. Well, the only consequence of that is that you're going to be incredibly poor. No health services, no education, no other kinds of entertainment services. And the way we know that people don't want that life is because we see that in how they move, right? They migrate from rural places in South Africa to the urban cities, even if those urban places are terrible, right? Even if they seemingly are, atrocious living conditions and poor health and unsafe, people still move there. And so why do they move? Well, it's because they believe that will give them a better life than where they came from. And that has been true not only in recent times, but throughout history, right? One of the big debates at the moment, actually, on the Industrial Revolution is what caused the Industrial Revolution, or the consequences for living standards. And many people claim, well, it's, the people were forced into cities, in these Liverpool and Manchester and these kinds of places with terrible living conditions, and so living standards decline. And only after the establishment of trade unions and these kind of things did we see an improvement in living standards. That's just wrong, right? There wasn't some kind of forced labor movement or slavery even. It was a voluntary movement of people from the countryside to the cities because their living standards, because it was better to live in those conditions than basically having a life in a countryside which is characterized by very high infant mortality, by absolute boredom, by doing exactly the same thing, by women being forced basically to work as textile workers with incredibly low income, and trying to take care of a large household with very meager access to nutrition. So people moved voluntarily, and so that's really the story of progress, right? This is, we should follow how people move, and that tells us what they prefer. That reveals their preferences.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I just wanted to pick up on a point that you made that I think people generally tend to overlook, or that they don't give enough airtime to, than obviously the idea deserves. But you spoke about how independence breeds poverty, and we obviously see that in North Korea and in other more closed-off societies. So I don't think people dispute that. But I think another crucial thing that people maybe don't realize is the extent to which independence of nations, or autarky, as it were, breeds war, and violence, as it were. Because what the free exchange of goods and services does is it forces nations to be in peace with one another. There's a wonderful quote, I forget its author, but he said, "We do to ourselves with embargoes what we do to our enemies in time. We do to ourselves with embargoes in times of peace what we do to our enemies in times of war," which I thought was extremely revealing. So I do think that the extent to which the freedom of trade and of the interdependence that you speak of, there's an extent to which it lessens violence and it lessens wars. Of course, you will get wars breaking out every now and then, but the extent to which they proliferate our world has significantly reduced. And then there's another important thing that you touched on, which was slavery. So I read last year, I believe it was last year, if not the year before, Thomas Sowell's Economics and Race. And I remember having this conversation with a friend of mine who just graduated actually from political science. But it astonished me that he didn't know the history of slavery, because every time we'd speak of slavery, he would only talk about the transatlantic slave trade. And I mean, for me, there's, that misses so much. Slavery is such an old institution, and I don't think people quite realize, the extent to which it proliferated our world even before the transatlantic slave trade was actually a thing. And I know that you speak about it in the book, and this is actually, feeding into one of my favorite chapters, which is about dowry and lobola, about the factor endowments, as you call them, and that, how property rights developed in various parts of the world, given the ratio of land to labor. So could you please just tell us just a little bit about that? I think people will find that immensely interesting. And just comment about the lack of knowledge about, the deep history of slavery, and it not just being a transatlantic thing.
Yeah. There are two questions. The first, I'll touch on one of the things that you mentioned earlier, which is the war, right? The kind of nationalism that's or independence leads to nationalism, leads to war. So that's certainly, I think, a very valid point. I would almost say that it's kind of true also at a local level, right? So I think people forget how important the market society is in creating trust, right? So trust is the fundamental, underpins basically a market economy, right? I won't be, if I don't trust my neighbor or my fellow South African, right, then I'm not going to go and buy with what is basically a fictitious piece of paper, right, which people just trust, a coffee. Because I don't know if that person, I can trust whether this is not some kind of poison, right? That to kind of make it extreme. So we actually have a very high level of trust in South African society, even though we tend to think we don't, right? We see the violence, we see the mistrust on social media, but in fact, just the pure fact that we can have 20,000 students that don't know each other arrive in a few days' time here on Stellenbosch campus, and we don't expect any violence. We don't expect, there shouldn't be any kind of, theft or crime or anything like that. That's incredible. That, these people don't know each other at all, and yet we somehow harmoniously live together, right? And of course, there are exceptions, and the fact that that those exceptions make national news is actually a signal of the immense trust we have in that they shouldn't happen, right? So that's an incredibly positive story, and that's I guess it's true not only obviously for our society but for most societies in the world, but it's not true in societies where you don't have this kind of market mechanism, where there is in fact a dictator or a hierarchy of leadership, authoritarian leadership, where the only person that you basically have to adhere to is those that are in charge, and you really don't know whether you can trust your neighbor. Ask anyone who's lived in a communist society, they would tell you, you can really not trust your neighbor there because they might be spies, right? And so this is complete breakdown of the market mechanism and this interdependence that requires us to be that allows us to be rich. So I thought that's also, I guess, a more optimistic take on the South African society. There are, of course, things that hurt this trust, right? So violence and crime and these kind of things reduce our trust, and so that's why it's really important to fight those kinds of things. And of course, one might make even the point that things like social media, these extreme views, break down that trust that actually exists at a personal level. And so thinking about how technology both increases, allows this exchange to happen, but also reduces trust in some way where we see these extreme views being spewed, and then how that affects how we view others. I think those are really interesting research questions. So I think I just wanted to mention that. And the second thing is in terms of slavery. So of course, slavery is an age-old institution, right? The word slave comes from Slavic, Eastern Europe. So it's not something that is unique to Africa or to Europe. It is something that occurred almost in all ancient civilizations. And in fact, it's really only in the by the, I would say, 16th century that you'll find some wealthy civilizations, think of Western Europe, the Dutch, for example, where slavery is actually outlawed, right? And this is a a unique institution. Of course, it's outlawed within Europe, but it's not outlawed for those countries to undertake slave trading outside of Europe. So that's this ambiguous relationship with slavery that many European countries had. But the point is, it's an age-old institution, and of course the case for Africa is that it's especially here an institution that had deep economic roots, because indeed Africa is a land abundant, labor scarce continent, and that means that that the most valuable commodity really is not land, because land is abundant, so it's cheap. You can easily move away from your family or tribe and find land elsewhere. The valuable commodity is labor, is to work the fields. You need people, and there's just a scarcity. Basically, most African pre-colonial societies used family labor mostly, but then there would have been war or conflict, between different neighboring groups, and they would have captured not the land of those people, but the people, because the people is scarce. And so that was a form of indigenous slavery that when the Europeans arrived on the coast, they exploited. And that's also true, right? That the transatlantic slave trade is an extreme version of the slave trade. So it's not just a copy of what happened in indigenous slavery. It is an extreme version of that, and it's of course at a much bigger scale than what came before. So there is a difference between the indigenous slavery of what happened in Africa and the Atlantic slave trade, but it's also that's true, but it's also not that there was no form of indigenous slavery before. These institutions occurred throughout the world, and especially on the African continent for millennia. And of course, you can go back to pre-colonial, and then even deeper into history, and you would have found some form of coercion, right? So slavery is of course a very specific definition of a version of coerced labor, but there's even into the present versions of coercion, and so slavery is somewhere on this continuum, and these are fascinating histories to study. And how various kinds of policies or institutions exploit labor, and how that shapes the later kinds of institutions you've mentioned, the Lobola, and how that has pre-colonial roots is, to me, very fascinating story to tell. But I do think the study of slavery helps us understand something about the process of economic change. The process. So, more broadly speaking, we tend to think that people get rich through the exploitation of others. I think that's very common perception of how wealth is created. But indeed, if that is the case, then if slavery was an institution for most of human history, and in fact, dominated almost all civilizations, then why didn't previous civilizations experience something like an industrial revolution? So, or this miraculous increase in living standards over the last 2 centuries. It's actually over the last 2 centuries when slavery has moved out or become unpopular as an institution, and in much of the rich world has completely disappeared. We see an increase in material welfare that is ahistoric, right? So it's to say that slavery is required for the creation of wealth, I think, is just fundamentally wrong. It's in fact because of what I would say innovation, entrepreneurship, technological improvement, we see the removal of the need for slavery. It's in fact now unnecessary to exploit people to such an extent, and that's why we see much higher living standards, not only for the rich of society, but for what we would traditionally have considered the poor.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I like that chapter is because it actually made me think quite a bit. So how have institutions that developed during such economic times, or let me rather phrase the question in the following way. So there are a set of institutions such as Lobola and Dowry that developed as a result of, I would say, primordial economic circumstances. How do such practices and institutions that we know are deeply ingrained in people, how do those institutions survive today, given the changing economic landscape? Do we still see the kind of factor endowment relationship that you speak of in the chapter, exist today in some form or another, or have those institutions been replaced by new institutions that have now, been developed as a response to the kind of economic situation that we live in today?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I don't think we see Lobola today because of factor endowments. I think it's some, as you say, like a pre-colonial or primordial economic factor endowment argument, and then we see the creation of a cultural institution, right? And culture persists across generations, even sometimes if the reasons for the emergence of those cultural factors changes. And so that's exactly what's happening now, right? So we have this institution called the Lobola, and I think that's a fascinating area to study, because now the economic reasons for its emergence have changed. But it still persists, and it now has economic consequences in a way that doesn't kind of meet what the original needs for it were. So, the fact that, for example, 60% of children in South Africa are born to single mothers, that is incredibly strange, right? And what is the reason for that? Well, surely there must be something about the mechanisms for marriage that reduce the willingness or ability of people to match. And so the Lobola must feature in there, right? It must be. So now it has these kind of consequences for us. And, we tend to see it as something of kind of a contemporary issue, but it has deep historical roots. And the question is, how do we now navigate this cultural institution in this completely new economic environment? And I don't have the answers to that, but I think it's a fascinating question, and clearly it has consequences for society. I just don't know exactly, how. I think the question about how to manage cultural change what drives cultural change is a fascinating thing that economists are at the moment actually kind of entering but it's a very difficult and a fuzzy concept, of course, and so it's very difficult to understand exactly what the mechanisms are. But the fact that cultural beliefs, cultural traits have economic consequences is very clear. So in that chapter, I show how economic forces, or factor endowments, shape cultural beliefs, but those cultural beliefs also now have economic consequences. And if you want different economic kind of consequences, you of course need to change those cultural beliefs. And how that happens, it's not, to me, very clear.
I find that incredibly interesting. And now as you're speaking, I'm thinking about so many things. And I know we're running out of time, but I just want to ask this question. Is there, according to your knowledge, an economic justification for the emergence of religion in one way or another, or animism, as it were, or as it was first practiced out in society? Is there an economic reason for that? Because I'd be very interested in finding out if that has economic roots. Maybe not economic in the monetary sense of the word, but maybe in the exchange sense of the word. Is there something that led to the development of animism, among other things?
Yeah, I mean, this is of course this is not my field of expertise, so I should be cautious in saying anything really on this topic. But I what does religion do? It kind of unites people in a kind of shared belief system, and that reduces. So people of disparate cultures or ethnicities or whatever now that share a common religion now have reduced. Or more trust, so they have reduced transaction costs. So again, it kind of boils down to the trust. So if people all have share the same beliefs, and they show that through certain kinds of behavior. Religions all have certain traditions and rules and regulations, and the way I show that I'm part of this religion might allow me to transact with someone of a completely different ethnicity or language group or whatever. But because we have this shared belief system and my behavior shows that, we have higher levels of trust, and so that reduces our transaction costs. So long distance trade becomes much easier if you share the same belief system. Right? So that might explain why religions emerge and why they then spread, because they are a way of lowering transaction costs. That's just one theory. There's of course many different theories of the emergence of religion and why certain types of religion. I'm not also going to say that there wouldn't be leaders, of course, and very specific kinds of events play a role in determining which religions and warfare and these kind of things. But fundamentally, I think you could think of religion as a way of reducing transaction costs and allowing a more kind of interaction beyond just the family unit. I leave it there.
That's very interesting. And then I think maybe just as a final question, maybe not about the book, but about the economic history discipline itself. So what about somebody what would you say to somebody who's listening to this and thinking that, it's a bit like we can sort of fit every historical event into an economic landscape. And I know some people will view that as maybe a good thing, but and I imagine other people as well who have read Karl Popper tend to worry about this because of the theory of falsification, because it does seem to me that, it's unfalsifiable. So if I ask about religion, there's a story that you can fit in. If I ask about something else, there's another story you can fit in. It does seem to be unfalsifiable. And we know, if we've read Karl Popper, that, the unfalsification or the unfalsifiability of a claim is a test, not of its strength, but of its weakness. Is that something that concerns you sometimes? Just as it's concerning me a little bit now? Or are there other things that we know for a fact developed outside of an economic lens?
Yeah, it's that's a great point, and there's always this tension between history and economics, actually, because the history, the discipline of history is very much a multi-causal discipline. Economics is very much a monocausal discipline, where we really want to, we want to show that it's this one factor that explains something, whereas history is typically, historians typically believe the world is very much multifaceted, which it probably is. And it's very difficult to find this one causal mechanism. I would say that the field of economic history has benefited a lot from the data revolution and the kind of move towards better what we know as identification. So to identify this one causal thing, or perhaps several causal things, we have ways, methodologies now of testing that. And so within the field, we are moving closer to the Popperian kind of falsifiability, right? So if I have a belief about your point about religion, so how would we then test this? Well, we would need to find several societies, some where religion emerges, others where there's no form of religion, and then let's see if in fact there's greater transaction or lower transaction costs within those societies. It's obviously going to be very difficult to find data on that specific example, but that would be the kind of test, right? So in the book Christianity, and we can then test, what happens to those places where missionaries arrive versus those where they don't, and see what the effects are. And what we find basically is that in those places where missionaries arrive, those people are more prosperous today than where they don't. And of course, you have to think, well, is this a pure natural experiment? Because maybe the missionaries went to the nice places and they were already rich, and we have ways to kind of think about that and take care of that. And then the question is, why is it that is it the fact that Christianity makes you wealthier? There are certain scholars who've said that before, but what we kind of see is that it's actually that these missionaries don't only they don't only convert souls, they don't only bring the religion, but they actually also teach people to read the Bible, and it's the literacy that seems to make the big difference. And we know that education, human capital creation is a cornerstone of economic growth. And so that fits again into a kind of economic theory that we understand. So the point really is that we have our theories about how the world works, but increasingly we have the ability to test those theories in the kind of Popperian world, where we have a control in the treatment group, and we can actually see what the effects are, and prove or confirm our theories, or say dismiss them and say this is clearly not wrong, and now we need a new theory.
Hugely insightful. Prof, we could go on speaking like this for a very long time. I've just checked and we're running out of time now. So maybe just as a final word from you to the potential reader of the book, what is it that you would hope for people to get out of the book? In other words, why do you think people should invest their money in buying the book? Is there anything that you think in particular they should expect from getting the book? Or what exactly were you trying to relay, other than what we've obviously just discussed over the past 50 minutes?
I think people have a very specific view of history as just a lot of facts, right? And sure, there are some facts in the book, but to me, it's more about understanding why we are where we are. So it's not like, the book, I had lunch recently with someone who couldn't understand that I've written a book on global history covering all time periods, and it's only 200 odd pages, right? That's impossible, he said to me. Well, sure, I don't cover all, civilizations and all kind of kings and that's not the point. It's not to write the history of the world. It is really to help us understand how we came to where we are today. And in that, I think economics matters a lot. Understanding the economic forces that drive us to the last 2 centuries, especially in creating this immense prosperity. And so it's really about, and I do that not just by kind of rehashing economic theory, but really trying through some anecdotes and then some statistics to show the kind of lessons of the past, things which went well, places that prospered, but also places, you mentioned Argentina to bring us back to the start of the conversation, places that, seemingly had everything going for it and then fell behind and stagnated. So I think those are, and I think, the feedback that I get from readers is that it's something that they didn't expect. It's a book where I think many people go in with the idea that it would be just a lot of history, and sure, there is a lot of history in it, but ultimately it's far more about these kind of lessons, these economic theories applied to the real world. So this is continuously updated. There's already a new version that will come out probably next year. There's an Afrikaans book coming out in the next couple of months. Hopefully there will also be a Xhosa translation soon. And every time there's a new issue, there will be an update, because this is a vibrant and dynamic discipline. There are new theories about how the world works. There are new tests for previous theories that either, again, support them or dismiss them. And so it's a dynamic process, and that to me is what science is all about. And so we keep on learning about how the world works, and hopefully that has application also for contemporary policies. For if we think about how to solve some of the major issues today, then lessons of the past and what worked, what didn't, in what context did it work, can help us solve this.
Yeah, absolutely. Winston Churchill phrased it as follows. He said, the further back we can look is the farther forward we can see. And I think that's a very good synopsis of the entire book. Prof, how do people get a hold of you? If they're obviously interested in the ideas, aside from buying the book. I know there's a website, but I'm not sure I quoted it correctly earlier on when I was talking about it. But how do we find you on your website? And how else, if there are any other avenues that you're available, can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, I last year started a Substack account. It's just johanfourie.substack.com, and Substack is a wonderful platform where kind of authors share their writings. And every Monday at 10 o'clock, I have a post that goes out to several hundred followers, and those can be my columns on News 24 or Rapport, or they could be just any kind of interesting ideas that I share. I also start this week actually by having guest authors contribute. So that I think on Friday it's a guest post by Professor Jan van Zanden on Dutch colonialism and slavery. So I think that should also be fascinating to readers. But it's free to subscribe, and it's called Our Long Walk, which is of course a reference to the book. And it's trying to keep this conversation, updated and current. So listeners are more than welcome to subscribe, and I hope to see many of them do so.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll make sure to put all the details in the descriptor of this video so that people can obviously get a hold of it. Prof, I cannot thank you enough. I think we've redeemed ourselves, and I'm very, very happy about how this conversation has gone. Thank you so much for making the time.
Cool. It's great to be here, and good luck with the rest of the series.
Thank you so much, Prof.